You. It is morning.
Only just. Thank you for joining us. Mandela as a statesman, what role did you see him play in Africa?
Well, his role in Africa was really to be a symbolic inspiration. I mean, as you've heard in various interviews, I mean, people throughout the continent saw him as an example of the kind of leadership they wanted on the continent and of the kind of vision that they wanted on the continent. However, for a variety of reasons, he was not all that successful in persuading leaders on the continent to end conflicts. Part of the reason for that was that, unlike former President Mbeki, for example, because he'd been in jail for 27 years. He he traveled the continent in 62, but by the time he was released, he wasn't familiar with that generation of leaders. And also because, of course, what he and the government at the time were trying to convince people in the continent to do was to follow our particular path of getting warring parties together. And as you've heard in your interview with Ambassador Mpoko, that's often very difficult because the warring parties don't want to get together. So I think that his role, his inspiration to the continent was far more with its citizens than with its government.
6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are on the African continent at the moment. President Barack Obama visited recently and spoke of a very bright future for the continent. Do you see Nelson Mandela as someone that laid a foundation for this prosperous period that's lying ahead for Africa now?
Well, I think once again, his contribution to this was a sort of indirect contribution in the sense that I think that he inspired a lot of people. I would argue very strongly that one of the reasons we are beginning to see economic success in Africa is that Africa is becoming more democratic. African countries are more responsive to their citizens. They're more concerned to make sure that they're doing what citizens want them to do. And that always contributes to a growing economy. Now, Nelson Mandela didn't do that directly, but I think that if you talk to democracy campaigners on the continent, his name comes up repeatedly, and they identify with his values.
Is it the idea of him being in office for only one term, and that example maybe showing other African leaders that they shouldn't be president for life, as we've seen in many countries around the continent?
Oh, I think it's a huge issue, and I'm writing something about it this week. Remember, we've now had 4 presidents since 1994. I think that's going to be hugely important when people write the history of this country, because I think it sets a pattern in which nobody who's president of this country any longer can try to overstay their welcome. And that, of course, is the consequence of that one term. And obviously, if you speak to people across the continent, the idea of a president who, let's face it, could have stayed in office for 10, 15 years, nobody would have stopped him. The fact that that president decided to step aside sent this very clear signal that political office is something you do for a while to serve your country. It's not something you do for life to serve yourself. And I think that inspired many people on the continent.
I want to come back to South Africa and talk about where we are right now and the legacy of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Do you get a sense that we've lost our way a little bit in the last 10 years post the Nelson Mandela presidency?
Well, I think new democracies always lose their way to a certain extent. There's a wonderful Indian historian which says that all democracies are created by visionaries and presided over by mediocrities. Well, maybe he's being unfair, but the point he's making is life gets back to normal. You have ordinary politicians doing ordinary things, and people get a bit frustrated by that. I think one of the great ironies of the Mandela legacy is that very often people talk about him as the superhuman person, where he made it quite clear that he didn't want to be a superhuman person. And everybody talks about him as this individual, where he made it clear that he was a loyal member of his organization and that he'd been inspired by Sisulu and Tambo and Luthuli and all the other great figures in the ANC. And I think that the great legacy he should leave is that he didn't teach us that he's a superhuman being. He taught us what we're capable of as a society. And if South Africans start remembering that, then we can move forward.
How polarized are we right now as a nation?
Oh, I think we've seriously polarized. If you look at our discussion on the economy, if you look at our discussions on most things, South Africans are yelling at each other. And this is once again where the Mandela legacy comes in. Because there's been a lot of talk about forgiveness. I don't think he was particularly concerned about forgiveness. He was concerned about building a nation. He was concerned about building a society where people respected each other despite their differences. So he always used to listen, and he was always polite to the other side. And I think if we start listening to each other instead of yelling at each other, that is also the way forward for this.
Is this week the opportunity that we needed as a nation to go back to that vision?
Well, of course, one of the effects of his passing, as people have commented, is that it has united the nation. Unfortunately, the problem with South Africans is that we get united at periods like these, and then 3 months later we're fighting with each other.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we might take some of this and fight with each other less in the future.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Friedman. Very insightful look at the life and times of Nelson Mandela. It's time for us to cross to Cape Town. Of course, there's a special parliamentary session there this afternoon. Lucanio, it's over to you.